It's still the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, but the IMF says the outlook is somewhat less dire than previously expected. The fund has upgraded its forecast for global GDP growth to negative 4.4%. That's 0.8% higher than its estimate in June, when lockdown measures were at their peak. It's credited better than expected rebounds in China and other advanced economies. Quick action from governments and central banks to ease monetary policy and shore up businesses has also helped to limit the damage. But with several countries now facing a second wave of infections, tighter restrictions are being imposed again, including a return to lockdown in some places. It highlights how fragile and uncertain any economic recovery will be as long as the health risk remains.
Now, if this worsens and prospects for treatments and vaccines deteriorate, the toll on economic activity would be severe and likely amplified by severe financial market turmoil. Now, growing restrictions on trade and investment and rising geopolitical uncertainty could harm the recovery.
The consequences of the economic crisis have been felt around the world, but the IMF warns an unequal recovery could further widen the gap between rich and poor countries. The global economy is expected to return to growth of 5.2% by 2021, but emerging and developing countries, as well as vulnerable communities inside them, could fall behind without international support.
Now, emerging markets and developing economies are having to deal with this crisis with far fewer resources. Now, these economies will need to prioritize critical spending for health and support for the poor, and also ensure maximum efficiency. But they will also need continued support in the form of international grants, concessional aid, and in several cases, debt relief.
So while there are at last signs that the worst of the economic crisis is over, the hard work to ensure everyone can recover is just beginning. Miranda Lin, TRT World.
Stephany Griffith-Jones joins me now from Brighton in the UK. She's an economist and financial markets program director at Columbia University's Initiative for Policy Dialogue. Good to have you on the program with us. The IMF is forecasting a slightly less severe recession than it predicted in June. Why did it change its outlook in a more positive direction?
Well, I think the recent months have been better than they had forecast. China has done better because it controlled the epidemic, and the developed countries have done a little bit better. So they're a little bit more optimistic. On the other hand, as your report pointed out, we have very severe outbreaks of the pandemic. For example, in Europe, the situation is getting dramatically worse, and the measures that will need to be taken will clearly slow down the economy again. Mm-hmm. So I think the grounds for optimism, sadly, are not very big.
Right, that was the small bit of good news. The IMF is predicting more than 90 million people could be forced into extreme deprivation this year, and that developing and emerging economies were hit the hardest. What are the long-term effects that we could possibly be looking at here?
Well, this is really a bit of a tragedy because certain areas of the developing world, like Latin America and Africa, that had made very important progress, in social indicators, education, health, a number of dimensions, literacy, are going to be thrown back, the UN estimates, 15 to 20 years. So we're reversing in 1 year all the progress on social aspects that has been achieved with such effort. And secondly, we will not have as much ability to invest in the long term to facilitate long-term development. Investment, both public and private, is being cut back severely because there's so much uncertainty linked to the crisis.
Mm-hmm. These lockdowns and the measures that governments have put in place to try to contain the virus, we're still seeing a lot of those in many of these countries, and there's a big backlash now against these lockdowns. But the IMF says removing the lockdowns won't trigger a recovery. Why is that?
I think that's a really good question, because the problem is that if you remove the lockdowns, the pandemic will get worse. And if it's like what is happening now in the UK, where I live, for example. And then if it gets really bad, you have to impose even a stricter lockdown. So I think it's much better to get rid of the virus, which is what, say, countries like New Zealand or China or Korea have done. And once you have it really under control, ideally zero or very, very low, then you can reopen in a sustainable way. You can reopen the economy. But if you have all these waves, then the economy will do worse.
Yeah, we certainly are hoping that we can get rid of the virus and improve the global economy. Stephany Griffith-Jones, thank you so much for your time and insight into